Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 268. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm joined by author Sonia Daccarett to talk about her debut memoir, The Roots of the Guava Tree, Growing Up Jewish and Arab in Colombia. Sonia never intended to write a book, but as she reached middle age, she found herself looking back on a childhood that felt strangely distant from the life she was living now. Her memoir became a way to bridge those two worlds. Sonia grew up in Colombia, speaking a different language, surrounded by the vibrant culture of her country, as well as the traditions of her Jewish and Arab heritage. Her grandparents emigrated to Colombia and built a life there, and Sonia was always captivated by the stories, customs, and languages that shaped her family, and ultimately, her own identity. When she enrolled in a memoir-writing class, the memories began to surface in vivid sensory detail, eventually blossoming into the book she never expected to write. In this episode, I'll chat with Sonia about her writing journey, how her unconventional upbringing gave her the courage to move to the United States for college, and how she made peace with the universal feeling of never quite belonging, as well as a few other things coming up. Sonia Daccarett, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your debut book, which is a memoir, The Roots of the Guava Tree, Growing Up Jewish and Arab in Colombia. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Of course. First of all, I really did not set out to write a memoir. I did not set out to write a book. It really was never supposed to be a thing. What happened was a few years ago, something happened to me, which maybe happens to some of your readers, which is that I became middle-aged. And in the process of looking at my life and thinking about my life, I began to think a lot about my past and the fact that my past seemed disconnected from my present. And I think that is something that happens to many immigrants, especially. I think it happens to everyone, but I think in particular to many immigrants who have had a whole life in a different country, in a different place, in a different language, with different people, and they emigrate and they come to a new country, and their new life is very all-encompassing, and building a new life is very intense. And then once they hit a certain point, and for me, it was a point of, great joy and happiness and satisfaction with my life, but maybe the human tendency is to start looking back and thinking back about your life and what happened. And I realized that my life seemed to be completely separated by two periods and two things. And I really longed to reconcile them and braid them together for myself, for my kids, for my family, just to really understand what kind of human being I was, and the human beings, my family, the human beings that formed me, and the human beings I came from also. So I began to think a lot about these themes and decided to take a memoir writing class. I had a little more time in my life. I stopped working full time, and my kids were much older. And I just went to a memoir class, and the first prompt was, I don't recall exactly what it was, but it was write about something from your childhood. And all of a sudden these memories started piling out of all the little sensory details, all the things I remember from growing up in Cali, Colombia in the 70s, a place that was to me as a child quite magical and is now very different in many ways. The city has grown tremendously. I grew up in a very rural area in a house that my parents built from the ground up on top of a hill. So there was a lot of sensory detail, a swimming pool, giant cockroaches that swam in the pool, bats that came into my house at night, mangoes, monkeys on the mango tree. That's one chapter. And that's immediately just started tumbling out. And I couldn't stop writing. And I kept writing and writing and writing through the prompts of this memoir writing class. And I spent my career as a corporate communications professional, writing in a certain style and in a certain professional way. And one of the things I had to learn how to do, and my teachers were, and that memoir class led to many other memoir writing classes. They were so helpful in reteaching me how to write scene and write in dialogue and write in ways that were not necessarily press release format and professional. And it took me a little while to break out of my old writing patterns and start really becoming a more creative writer. But it was extremely helpful to put some of these memories in place. I guess from the sensory details that came out initially, then came the questions that I had never asked my parents and my grandparents about who we were and my identity and our identity as a family. My father was both my parents were born in Colombia, but my grandparents were immigrants to Colombia. My Arab grandparents were Christian Arabs from Ottoman era Bethlehem. And my mom's parents were Jewish immigrants escaping anti-Semitism in Europe in the 1930s. And my parents got married in the 1960s. It was quite unusual for an Arab to marry a Jew, I think, then and certainly now. So my family was really not at all normal in Colombia. And I had never really asked all of these questions. I had just always felt very like I really didn't quite fit in and that my family didn't fit in. And I was both fascinated by my grandparents' other languages and other cultures, but also not quite understanding where they came from and what their stories were and what that meant to me. And in the book, I started exploring a lot of those themes about identity, family, and diaspora and what it meant. And so out of a little memoir writing class started coming incredible, amounts of material that I then had to figure out what in the world to do with. And as the themes of identity, family, and diaspora became the through lines for everything that I was seeing, I started editing. And at that point, and this is probably around the pandemic time when I think so many authors kind of did a lot of writing and spent a lot more time thinking about personal issues or writing novels that they had always wanted to write. I had even more time to look at this vast amount of writing and figure out what to do with it. And at that point, I think I started realizing that I had a memoir on my hands and I needed to shape it into something that was interesting and readable for readers. It then took maybe another few years to get the courage to find a publisher and to publish what I think is a pretty personal memoir. I think many memoirists struggle with that. And here we are. That was what led to the book at this moment in my life.
I want to talk about maybe some of the key memories for you when they were all flooding back. What are a few that you wanted to make sure that you included in the book because they were, let's say, representative of some aspect or some theme that you were delving into?
Hmm. Sure. I think all of the memories that came back were very formative memories. I would say, as I said, some of the book or a lot of the book talks about the beautiful vegetation that exists in Cali, Colombia. It's a very tropical city. It's the second largest, I'm sorry, the third largest city in Colombia. It is very tropical and very hot at all times. The temperature rarely dips below probably 70 degrees. And so it's a city of heat and pools and beautiful mountains and flowers. and also a city that in the 80s, as I was coming of age, became unfortunately the one of the epicenters of the growing drug trade in Colombia, with the rise of the Cali cartel. And I can talk a little bit about what happened in Colombia during those years. So that some of those memories were very, very present in my mind because the memories of the increasing violence and instability that happened in Colombia were coincided with my coming of age, both politically and just personally as a teenager. And the second half of the book is quite connected to a lot of those memories. The first part of the book is more about childhood memories of being in the pool. One of the scenes, I got in the pool without really quite learning how to swim, and it was quite traumatic. And one of those scenes just came tumbling out immediately. One of the first things I wrote about was the day I nearly drowned. And there were other scenes that were, I would say all of those were just extremely formative. Everything in the book was how I remembered it and things that taught me lessons about my parents' values. There were several scenes where my parents both in ways that people don't parent anymore, and I wouldn't parent like this anymore, but my parents only hit me on very choice occasions, and they all had to do with entitlement and brattiness and with other people. And my parents' sort of values about social justice and being respectful to people who worked in our household and people who were around us. These were very formative memories of how strongly my parents felt about being respectful to other people. So some of those memories were right there. I mean, I think we all remember the day your parent unfortunately was not the best parent, the day your parent behaved in perhaps ways that were unfortunate, but I balanced it with all other stories that talked about my parents as human beings and as people, and also with a lot of, I would say, thinking about what they thought about their identity in those years, because things did shift, and the way that my parents probably felt about who they were when I was growing up became a little bit different later on as they also became middle-aged and started contemplating things more.
In writing those memories down and in writing those stories, did you have a different view of your parents? I mean, it's one thing to think about those memories and of being a kid and viewing your parents through that lens. But now that you're older, looking back at who they were, they were adults, they were people. And as a kid, I don't know that we necessarily think of our parents in that way as having their own worries and dreams and goals and loves and that sort of thing. Did you have a different view of your parents now after writing these stories?
Yes, one of the unexpected results of having written this memoir, and I think for memoirists in general, this is not unusual, but for me, I came away with a much greater appreciation, understanding, and deeper, if possible, love for my parents and my grandparents. I had to think about them as human beings and as adults and not just as my parents very deeply. And that was something that it took me a while to figure out how to balance that in the writing, because the writing is in present tense and it's very much from the perspective of whatever age I'm at in each chapter. So I try to write the way a 4-year-old would perceive the world, an
Mhm.
8-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 15-year-old. So it was when I did that, I thought it worked for me as a narrative strategy, but then there was a depth that was missing from analyzing whatever was going on with my parents in those scenes and in those moments. And I then relied on some speculation about why they were doing things and what led them to say the things they did and do the things they did. And I think that helped round out the book from a child's perspective, but also the speculation of a middle-aged person looking back. And in doing some of those speculative exercises like, I wonder what my parents thought when they decided to form a family. An Arab and a Jew get married and move to Cali, Colombia, and build a house on top of a hill and raise two girls with no religion, no identity, and no labels. And I think most teenagers are get a little grumpy with their parents, as I thought my parents hadn't been thoughtful and didn't really, consider our feelings and all of these things that teenagers think. And as I was writing this, I thought my parents were literally utopian, thinking that this would all work out. They truly thought it would all be fine. We love each other, it will be fine. And I didn't, until I wrote the book, I didn't quite realize or think about my parents as rebels. They just loved each other and they decided that they were going to live life on their terms and however they felt was the right way to live their life. And they didn't care what their families thought and what anybody else thought. I felt like probably most teenagers felt that my parents were pretty conventional in some ways and did conventional things. My dad went to work, my mom stayed at home, she ran the household, my dad, made a living. But when I looked back on them, I just all of a sudden came away with this great admiration for their rebellious and independent-minded nature and the fact that they thought everything would be fine in this very utopian way. My parents believed in rationality and in the future. And for example, they sent me to an American school because it was the only secular school in Cali, Colombia. And so English was the language of the future for, that would open doors for children. And I learned English at a very young age at the American school. I write about it in my book as well, the process of being a Spanish speaker and then slowly converting into a bilingual person. And these were things that my parents thought were good, rational, modern, normal. They just really had great belief in the power of living your life and being independent people. In a place that was not particularly, Cali, Colombia was it's always a well, wonderful city, but it was, fairly homogenous, fairly, most Colombians are Catholic, most people have some sort of faith practice. And it was amazing that my parents really considered this to be a perfectly normal way to decide how to live their lives when I look back.
Well, what about how you viewed your younger self as you were writing these stories? Again, did you look back on that 4 year old, that 8 year old, that 16-year old and think now as an adult, what was I thinking? Or did you find that you felt more compassion towards her, wanting to extend more grace to her? What were your impressions of yourself going when you were going through these memories?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was a little bit painful to go back
Mm.
to those places that I really didn't really want to unpack anymore. My childhood was in many ways happy, but also in many ways extremely confusing. My parents felt that they didn't know. I have very thick, very curly hair, and they didn't actually know what to do with it. My mom, in particular, she was in charge of my hair, and she just kept it short. Since I wrote the book, I have heard from so many women about their pixie cuts and how traumatizing they were, and particularly American women with Dorothy Hamill haircuts, which I had never heard of, but apparently that was a thing, and how traumatizing short hair can be for a little girl in an extremely gender traditional society, which was in Cali, Colombia, you were either a boy or a girl. There was nothing, that was it. They also decided that earrings were medieval, or, you weren't, most little girls in Colombia get their ears pierced in the hospital after they're born, and they have earrings. And it's just a cultural norm to have earrings if you're a girl, and also to have long hair. Or certainly this was the norm in the 70s. Obviously, so many things have changed. But um, so I had short hair, I had no earrings. My father's an Arab, my mother's Jewish. We have no religion, and I go to the American school. So I felt so alien and so strange. And I desperately longed for long hair. I have a long chapter where I talk about my mom's attitudes about hair and my grandmother's hair, and all of these sort of cultural norms. Everybody had really thick, curly hair on both sides of my family, and how all the women in my family dealt with their hair. But I really just wanted to have long hair and wear it in braids or in with pretty ribbons. And that was just not something that was accessible to me. So I spent my childhood just feeling really strange. And I also, I was not a particularly conventional child. How could I possibly be? So I sang songs out loud, and I learned to play guitar very early on. That was a gift also that my parents gave me, and I talk a lot about my beloved guitar teacher who gave me so much. But I was just a really odd little child with short hair that brought the guitar to school and played guitar for my friends. And I was also quite chatty, I think, and my parents, I now realize that their refusal to some extent to answer my questions like, who are we? Why don't we have a religion? What are we if you're an Arab and and you're a Jew, and what does that mean, and etc. My father spent my entire childhood in my perspective was that he would answer only the smallest amount of information, not going further. So I only had little bits and pieces of answers that he gave me. And when people at school would ask me, what are you? I would try to parrot the little lines that he gave me. I now realize that they were also trying to protect me from the slings and arrows of people who might have been hateful, or people who might have said weird things, or people who might have judged me for not being this or that, and particularly because I was chatty, and I think they tried to not give me talking points. So the other thing that I realized looking back is that I'm so I felt so different. I felt so out of place. I felt so desperately wanting to belong. And those were all things that served me in life to be more compassionate and to try to understand other people. I ended up being kind of the welcoming person at school for any new students, that sort of thing, because I always felt compassion for people who didn't fit in, and for people whose life was a little bit as an felt outsidery. I also realized that most people feel this way at some point. It's a human condition to not feel like you don't fit in, or that you're different, or that in some way or another you are alien to the world around you. And I have come to realize that that is much more normal than I thought when I was growing up. I thought I was the only one, or that there were only a few people like my friends, the oddballs, who were like that. And everybody else was completely happy and normal and fit in perfectly and had no problems. So that's clearly not true. And I've come to see that as an adult and through the process of writing the book as well.
Right, right. It's one of the I think one of the cruel ironies of life is that you spend most of the time thinking that you're alone in it. You're
Hmm.
the only one experiencing it, and the reality is that most people around you are experiencing something similar, and we are much more alike in that way than we think. But I'm also curious. In looking back at your younger self, I'm sure she had goals and dreams and plans for what her life would become. In looking back at that, how closely aligned are you now with what you thought life would be like when you grow up?
That's a very good question. I think the little girl that I was really just longed for my family to be happy and rooted with what they had. The title of the book actually comes from a chapter where we moved to our new neighborhood, which is in Ciudad Jardín. It's a neighborhood that has now become quite large, and the city has grown up around it. But when my parents bought the plot of land and built a house, it was really an up and coming neighborhood that was fairly remote in the southern part of the city. And there was a guava tree that predated my parents on the property. And that tree was prolific in its production of fruit. And it's a through line in some of the early childhood memories of this endless amount of guavas plopping into the pool, plopping all over the garden. It was just my parents desperately trying to give it away. My father annoyingly fishing them out of the pool. My uncles who would come to visit, throwing the guavas as a game. It was just very present and it was a very happy tree, rooted wherever it was. It didn't matter. It was just happy. My dad also really wanted to have a garden with Middle Eastern vegetables. And I don't know, he had great goals for his garden, but it never worked because Cali's weather is very tropical and only tropical plants will thrive there. So it was just an exercise in his frustration trying to plant things that didn't work. So that was the kind of metaphor for me, and the title of the book of what I longed for was a happy family and a place, people who were happy with their life, and if they weren't happy with their life, at least constructively tried to make it so. I think where I ended up as an adult is a place like that, where I really try to practice gratitude and be happy with my life, not in a Pollyanna way, obviously, but just there's so much to be grateful for. There's so much to be delighted by. I have also been very fortunate in my life. I have a wonderful family and I have, a life that I feel is wonderful. So I think that's where I ended up. The little girl really just wanted that, and I, the angry teenager that left. I in the end of the book decide to emigrate to the United States. At the time, it was not emigration. I had a choice between going to college in Colombia or coming to college in the United States, and in some sort of brazen teenage completely unthought through process, decided to come to the United States because it was far away and it was the furthest place I could think of to run away from my family and my country and my parents. And I ended up here as an immigrant trying to figure out what to do with my life. But honestly, it worked out. And I think I look back at the little girl and I just wish that she had had, I think, probably happier parents who had been able to understand that there was a lot of love and a lot of good things that they could have figured out how to work with.
You mentioned earlier that you've heard from, women talking about, yeah, growing up with curly hair, for example. I'm curious
Uh-huh.
what the reaction has been for people who have read your book, either people who know you now, maybe people who knew you then, or people who don't know you at all. What their impressions are, because anybody that reads a memoir thinks, well, now I know them a bit better. I'm
Hmm.
curious what feedback, what reactions you have received.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, somebody I know said to me, "Oh, how does it feel to have people know everything about you?" And I just laughed, because if you think that everything about me is in that book, wow, it
Right.
would have been a 19 tome. Uh, no. So, I'll back up and say one of the challenges for many memoirists is just that feeling of exposure that you've alluded to. I think it took me a long time to get over it and not be bothered by it. I think until not at the minute, I would say until a few months after the book came out. And all of a sudden, I was just hearing from people and readers how they connected to it. And I had curly hair too, and my parents kept it short. And the thing about the Dorothy Hamill haircuts, or my parents were this, or I'm half this, half that, and it was also hard for me, or I grew up in another country and it was complicated. And all of a sudden, I just thought that was such a wake-up call for why are we all keeping these secrets and thinking that it's so shameful and all of these things that we're so worried about exposure about certain things and certain details of our lives when we all have them. It's the human experience to have these things. Everybody's childhood is filled with confusion and not understanding and all of these moments. And it was so liberating to just all of a sudden feel like, okay, so I wrote about my family. Okay, people know about it. Some parts of it, some parts of my parents' relationship and some parts of my grandparents. And so what? Everybody has that to some extent. The other thing that happened, I think, after the book came out is my dad passed away, and my mom, who has been extremely supportive, but I think she has said that she feels a little exposed in the book because I do write a lot about her. She's a great character. I mean, my mom is such a character, and I had to write about her. But my dad's also a great character, and I had to write about him. I think they were always in my mind as characters, waiting to be explored. And my mom has said, that it at least feels like a little bit of my dad and his humanity has been put on the page, and
Hmm.
it's a memorial to him in some ways. And I actually agree. I didn't write the book in with that intention at all, but it does feel like my dad is a little bit there in a book, and we have preserved some of his memories of who he was.
Right. What a happy surprise to come out of that.
Yes. Yes, because it was not a happy going into the decision to publish the book was not happy. It was full of stress. It was full of anxiety. It was full of second guessing myself and wondering if I was really revealing too much information about my family and about family members and friends and etc. And I was so careful to walk the line with integrity between what is my story and what is somebody else's story. And I was very careful to not reveal anything from about people's private lives that was not my business to reveal. But I'm still talking about my perspective and my relationship with people, which certainly is makes it personal and reveals personal details about family members and certainly friends. As I was getting older and being an adolescent, I talk a lot about a very good friend that I had who was very socialist and had very left-wing political opinions, and how I was so worried for his well-being at a time where in Colombia it was very, very dangerous to be a left-wing person. So some of those things I had to really consider very carefully how I would write about them.
Yeah. In undertaking this exercise, I'm curious how well your memory held up. Did you find if you had to do research into something that you remembered it accurately, or if you heard from family members, maybe your mom or your sister or whoever, to say it didn't happen that way, I don't remember it like that, I would never have said something like that. I'm just curious because in talking with people who've written memoirs, it's a tricky thing. Your memories versus maybe what other people perceived as having had happened or the conversations that took place.
Yeah, that's always the memoirist challenge, right? It's my memory, my recollection of what
Right.
happened versus your recollection. I would say that I've had a few, but small, but why didn't you say this? Or do you remember that? Or how come you didn't write about this? Or how come you didn't write about that? Questions from friends and family. But I have not had that is not at all what happened.
Mm.
That would be a horrible thing to hear. I think I was very careful to run certain scenes and certain things by my family, even though they didn't like them or some of them may have had issues with them. I just wanted to make sure that I was actually remembering things correctly. I also did research and I went back to whatever I had, which, tapes. There, I'm dating myself, tapes and uh, things that remained. I mean, not my family was not a lot of, there were not a lot of record keeping and letters and things like that, but I did go back to try to make sure that at least the facts of the story were correct, and facts about Colombian history and the years when certain things happened. And in the book, I talk a lot about formative moments in my life where Colombia in the 1980s was really going through a third party civil war between the drug cartels, the government, and the left-wing insurgent guerrillas, and just a sea of violence that started engulfing the country in those years. And I just had to go back and make sure that my recollection of certain events, like for example, the takeover of the Colombian Supreme Court. Now I'm trying to remember the exact date. I believe it was 85, 80, 84, maybe, by left-wing insurgent guerrillas, where half of the Colombian Supreme Court justices ended up killed. And that was just such a searing moment for all Colombians. the assassination of the justice minister at one point, those sorts of moments where we all remembered. I just had to go back and remember and make sure that they were factually correct. And so I did that. I went back and researched that. And the other incredible tool that I had was my dad was a Super 8 film aficionado.
Hmm.
And I write about it in the book about why does my dad take all these movies of flowers and the pool and the brick wall in our backyard and the house. This is so boring. And he spends all this time doing this. Now, as I was writing this book, I realized what a treasure trove of footage he left me because I went back and watched all of those movies. Some of them brought back some painful memories, some of them brought back beautiful memories, but they also brought back the vividness of what the flowers looked like, what the brick wall looked like, what the pool looked like. And it really enabled me to make sure that my memories of those things were actually reflected in what I was looking at in the Super 8 video footage that he left me. So I did have some material to rely on for
Wow.
accuracy.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, again, what a gift.
Such a gift. Such a gift. Yep.
Well, I'm curious where you go from here. So you've got this book, it's now out in the world. Are there more books in you? Do you have a desire to write something else, continue down memory lane, or try a different genre? Or is this it?
No, it's not it.
Excellent.
I do have, I think, at least another book or two in me. I'm not exactly sure where I'm headed. I think one of the ideas that I had was, and I have some writing done, was the next chapter the book ends when I'm leaving Cali and I'm going to college to be a student. And many readers have said, you have to write the next one because I need to know what happens. So what happened after that? So it's funny. There's some demand for that next chapter of what that experience is like. I think some of it is about being an immigrant and immigration and what it felt like in the 80s to be a student in the United States, and some reflections on who I was then. Same thing. Who was that young person? And some of it is so cringy. As I do the writing, I'm like, you have to have courage to go there, but it's tough. Um, so there's that. And I'm also, through the process of writing this book, I did a lot of research about my grandparents' immigration experiences to Colombia. And
Hmm.
until I wrote the book, I honestly had not really thought what it would be like so I'll talk about my Jewish grandparents first. They left a small town in Ukraine and got on a boat in Europe, probably in Italy, and then they crossed the world. These were people who lived in small towns and small, very, very insular Jewish communities, crossed the world. Each of them came separately alone because there was no money for the whole family to come. And they landed in Barranquilla, which is the Colombia's Atlantic port. At the time, it was a very big international port. And Barranquilla is incredibly hot and humid and tropical and Caribbean. And my grandparents, I have one tape where they talk about getting off and being just like that. We've never felt heat like this. We've never felt humidity like this. We have never seen these weird fruits, mangoes, bananas. What is that? They had never seen sort of the racially diverse society that is Colombia. So they had never seen Black people or indigenous people. They came from small towns in Ukraine. And then they each took another boat down the center of the country, all again by themselves, not speaking a word of Spanish, and looking at, the crocodiles and the monkeys I mean, Colombia is a beautifully biodiverse country, and it must have been such a journey. And I just, and then they arrive on the interior of the country, which is a whole other world. And I think my grandparents literally landed on Mars and somehow had the courage to start new lives in this very, very, very strange place that was so different from the places where they came from. My Arab grandparents did the same journey. My many Christian Arabs from Ottoman era, Palestine and other places, Syria, Lebanon, etc., from the Levant, settled in Barranquilla. And they, again, another very different world from where they came from, and started new lives and created communities and businesses. And it's a sort of, people haven't, it's not as well known of a story that there's a very, very big Christian Arab diaspora in Colombia, but also not just in Colombia, but all over Latin America from this period of time. So those immigration stories are very interesting to me, and sort of historical fiction would be a fascinating way to explore some of the stories and the characters and the diaspora narratives of Christian Arabs and also Jews, because they're so little known. I think in this time of polarization, there's sometimes one story, but people don't know that sometimes Jews live in South America. People don't know that Arabs live in South America. Sometimes people don't know that Arabs are Christian too. So I think that has been a really interesting part of this memoir that I did not consider. I did a lot of the research specifically about my grandparents, but a lot of readers are very interested in that as well. So that could be another book idea that I'm exploring. But I haven't settled on which one is kind of going to really take up the rest of my time yet.
Okay. All right. Well, it sounds like you certainly have plenty of material to keep you busy. Either avenue, whichever path you choose to walk
Correct.
first.
Yes. Yes.
And well done to you for taking that memoir class, because it's led here. So thank you for doing that.
Oh my goodness, I have all I have my teachers to thank. They were really formative and very supportive. So it was really a wonderful way to start writing in a new genre that I actually have grown to love. That I really hadn't read many memoirs before that experience.
Yeah.
And now I have read many. Now I love reading memoirs.
It makes you appreciate it, because it's not an easy task. It is not for the faint of heart.
Right. Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, if people want to learn more about you and the book, and watch out for when there'll be a book two coming, where can they go to find you and that information?
Sure. You can go to the publisher's page, Simon and Schuster, and look up either my name or The Roots of the Guava Tree, Growing Up Jewish and Arab in Colombia. I also have a website called soniadaccarett.com, and you can find all the information about the book and where to buy it on that website. And I have an Instagram page. You can look it up by my name, Sonia Daccarett author, and I'm also on Instagram.
Good, good. And if they want to purchase a copy of The Roots of the Guava Tree, best place to go is to your website, and then from there?
I mean, it's available on Amazon, but we all have different priorities and perspectives on Amazon. You can also buy it from the publisher's page. You can also buy it from your small independent bookstore. If they don't carry it, they can always order it. So there's lots of different ways to purchase a copy.
Excellent. Well, Sonia, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with The Roots of the Guava Tree, Growing Up Jewish and Arab in Colombia. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate your invitation.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.